Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Senior Living Today. With us today is Janie Gardner, the daughter of two of our Springfield Masonic community residents. Thank you so much for joining us today, Janie.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So this is your first time on our podcast. So would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your connection to the Ohio Masonic communities?
Sure. So like you said, my name is Janie, and I am the adult daughter of two Springfield Masonic community residents. My parents live in independent living, and I live about an hour and 10 minutes away from where they are now, and live with my husband, and I have two adult daughters who live in the area.
Well, once again, thank you for joining us. So let's talk a little bit about your parents and the journey they've had at our communities. So how many years have they lived at Springfield Masonic Community?
Gosh, I'm not positive. I think 3 or 4.
So they've been with us for a little bit of time.
Yes.
And can you tell us just a little bit about their story and how they came to live in our community?
Sure. Yeah, I think it may be unique given what I've heard from some friends and coworkers of mine who have parents around my parents' age. One Thanksgiving, I was in Maryland at my parents' former home with my brother and our families, and our parents told us that they had some news, and they sat us down at the kitchen table. I mean, there was no way we could have predicted it, but they let us know that they decided to begin a search to move to a retirement community closer to where we lived. Like I said, we did not expect that. That was not something that we had discussed. Both my parents were ambulatory and doing fairly well, living on their own at the time. But my mom had recently recovered from a back surgery, and she knew that if either of them needed something similar in the future, they couldn't adequately take care of each other. So they brought this up. They estimated, this isn't going to be for 5 years at least. And Dad was a little less on board than Mom. But they thought, gosh, this is going to be way in the future. And so they did some online research and narrowed it to about 10 different communities. And I went with them to all 10 visits and interviews. And my brother went on some as well. And they decided on what we call SNC.
So during the process, were there any conversations that you and your brother were having with your parents, or what did that process look like as you were kind of touring the communities? Did you have a great deal of input in the one that they eventually decided on, or how did that process work with your family?
Great question. Yes, we had a lot of input. Part of that was especially my mom, but our parents wanted our input and talked about that. Even at that very first conversation, they said, as we go through this, we're going to want you to be as involved in the process as possible. And then part of it was just kind of the nature of myself and my brother. Sometimes, as you can imagine, the children might have different questions than the parents do who are living there. And so it was great to have all 4 of our minds, plus our spouses were there for some of those as well, all 4 of those minds. But so my mom is very organized, and she had folders, color-coded folders for each of us. She had printed a checklist of common questions to ask, I guess, from online that was in each of our folders. We had pens that she provided and blank pages to take notes. So for each of these appointments, and like I said, I went to all of them with her, we had those. So they came up and had some visits, because it's about an 8-hour drive from where they were to my house. We would get a few in at a time, and we would sit with the folks who would give the tour and then have a conversation at the table and just kind of listen to my parents' questions. And they were kind of funny they each had, their own things they wanted to focus on. And then we would chime in and then talk about them. And yeah, SMC was a clear winner. We turned to SMC before they made their final decision. And that's where we had even more family members, like I said, our spouses there, just to ask some final questions and make it happen.
Well, that's nice because it sounds like you guys had a really collaborative process as a family and you were all kind of involved in the decision making. I was just curious. So, do you have any advice for families, specifically for adult children? I mean, I think it's great that in this case, your parents kind of took the lead and they were thinking ahead and knowing that they wanted to move to a community. But sometimes I feel like it's the opposite, where maybe the child realizes that mom or dad might need a little bit of extra care and should maybe be moving into a community. So, do you have any advice for children when it comes to talking to their parents through this process?
Yeah, I feel so grateful that my parents thought of this on their own. I mean, looking back, and like I said, hearing from some friends and colleagues and coworkers of mine who do not have that kind of intent on their parents' part, it's a struggle. And depending on how well their parent is functioning and what they do, what the needs are medically or otherwise, it's so difficult to, from what I've seen as adult children, to kind of convince your aging parents that they might need some additional help, because I understand how scary that is and how they don't want to let go of that independence. So I guess my advice would be maybe start early, first of all, to think about that conversation before maybe the parent is needing that additional help, and then it's a struggle to whether it's to get home health or whatever. And then second, maybe talk about the benefits of it. And the thing is, my brother and I didn't even know what the benefits of living in a community, which we may talk about later. So maybe kind of viewing it positively, a retirement community is not what it doesn't have to be, what maybe decades ago people thought. And I think sometimes just listening to your parents, listening to what their concerns are, what are their fears, because some resistance, if adult children are bringing this up, some of the resistance might be fear-based, and just understanding, like, I know that you're going to miss this, or I know you've been in this house for 45 years, or I know now you won't be close to X or Y. It's a big change. It's a huge adjustment, but here are what the benefits are. And I don't mean to sugarcoat it, but with any huge life change, there's going to be that adjustment, and acknowledge that it is difficult, but we're going to be here to help you with it. And so are these other people who are part of the community. So maybe focus on those aspects.
No, and I think that's great advice. I mean, I think sometimes when our loved ones are moving into a senior living community, they kind of focus more on what they're giving up rather than what they're gaining. So I think that's
Absolutely
great, like going in, asking the questions, looking at the benefits of it. But one of the other things I want to touch on that you mentioned was kind of the fear aspect of it. So when you were going through this process, I mean, I know your parents were actively looking, but I'm sure that they probably even still had some fears or some concerns when it came to moving to a community. So are there any of those fears that you'd be comfortable discussing with our listeners that maybe you talked about?
Yes, they talked about finances, and that was something that I believe my brother and I were almost more concerned than my parents, because they know their financial situation. Yeah. We weren't privy to the details, but that was something that we definitely wanted to talk about, and the financial in the sense of what happens later down the road. So not the initial, hey, how much is their rent, but okay, should they need care, and how does it cost anything to get a ride to the grocery store? Just all those little financial kinds of things, the meal plan. And the places, like I said, we visited multiple places. They varied. It was quite varied in the way that they handled it. And my parents loved the way that SMC handles that. So that would be one area. My dad, for sure, had a fear, I would say, from the questions and from the different things he said, I think he was afraid of losing independence. He was afraid of, I want to be able to still drive my car. At every interview and appointment we went to, he asked about parking. Was he allowed to park? Is there a parking space here? What if I'm driving to the dining hall? Where can I park? What if there are no parking spaces? So he was all about maintaining his driving independence. Which, fun fact, my parents have a garage for the first time in their lives now at SMC. They never had a garage before. They have a 2-car garage. And
you got the ultimate parking situation.
Exactly. I was like, Dad, look at this. You'll have space for the golf cart option. So that was a fear. And I bring up the driving, but losing independence. What happens if we can't walk to the dining hall? They worried with my mom's back surgery and her bad knees if it's snowy. So very practical kinds of worries of getting from one place to another. Who would clean their house if they're not capable of it? One of my concerns was because when they moved in, at the time, my mom was still able to drive. She's not now. My concern was if one of you needs extra care, one of you, and you have to go to even a temporary or short-term kind of rehabilitation, or can no longer live in independent living, how does that work? So both of you would move, sure. How does that look? But let's say one of you can still maintain, live in their independent home, but the other needs care. Can the one that doesn't need care still visit? Can we visit? And I think the last thing I can think of that was a fear was giving up what they have, like you said, which really it was replaced. It was there. It was just substituted with it. That all of those buckets were filled, but that was a fear. And then I think the socializing. They worried that they were maybe leaving some friends, and really the opposite happened. Is it okay to talk about that piece now?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, let's jump into
the social. Sorry, there's so much to say. They are thriving. My dad is an introvert. My mom is an extrovert. My mom is very social, and she has a particular way of interacting with people. She's, but she has made. They both have made very close friends, and my dad, as an introvert, I was shocked. He was like a new person. He was organizing, initiating, wanting to signing up for because there's so many options. There are outings, lunches you can go to. Then there are more organized events, or the woodworking shop or the craft shop or volunteering in the ice cream shop. All of these options. My dad was signing up for men's lunches and initiating different things. And he went to some poker. He never played poker. He was that, that I knew of. And my brother and I kind of thought, who is this person? Mom, we weren't surprised by her socializing, but they were busier. I mean, there were times where I thought, guys, you don't have to go to everything. you don't have to
stay home some nights if you want to.
Right. But which, by the way, when they were looking at places, it was very important, back to that independence, that there be a full kitchen where they lived. There were some communities where maybe the independent living did not have a stove, let's say, or what have you, depending on where it was housed. And that was very important to my mom. And I thought, how much are you really going to be eating at home, guys? And they thought they were a lot. And they're out and about. So that social piece, it's there if you want it. Sure, you don't have to. And there are times where I'm thinking, you could just slow down and stay home, but they love it.
And socialization is something that is so important for older adults. And it's something that can dwindle, honestly, when you are still living at home. And I think that's one of the great benefits of moving to a community. I agree. I think sometimes, older adults will think, well, if I move, then I'm going to lose my friends. I'm going to lose my social circle. But once again, thinking about all these things that you're going to gain. And I don't know if you mind talking about, but I know your dad's a pretty avid pool player, and that's something that he has been instrumental in organizing a pool group at the community, and also getting a new pool table donated. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of what he's enjoyed at SMC.
Yes. And kind of echoing how he was in terms of socialization, and how that pool table and that billiards room and the pool league came about was fabulous for my brother and I to watch. I'll never forget when there was a flyer that had his name, that he created, that there's a TV station that's for the community. And one day I was visiting my parents, and I think Mom had sent a picture of it too. And there's Dad's pool league, join our pool league flyer on this TV. And I was like, what in the heck? Come to find out, I think somebody had helped him print it, because I was like, wow, Dad, that looks amazing. Did you create that flyer? And I guess he had given the information. So yes, growing up, my entire life, my dad, before I was born, before my brother and I were born, he has always enjoyed billiards and played a lot. My brother plays a lot with him. I like it, but I'm not good. I don't do it enough. And but billiards is extremely important to him, to his history and his current enjoyment. To the point where when they moved out of that home, he had a pool table in our old basement and, kind of what to do with that. So I actually inherited that because my brother had already bought one for himself. So there's this room when they move in that had an older pool table that most people would be perfectly fine with, but Dad knows his stuff. And he checked it out. We checked it out, when we went visiting and interviewing there as well. And so then after they moved in, I'm not sure exactly how it started, but he had asked if there was a league, and there was not. And I don't know if years ago there had been one. So he decided to start one. And like I said, it was not surprising that he wanted a league and wanted to be part of a league, but that he initiated some of that. And so, yeah, they have their pool nights. And he, like you said, was instrumental in getting a replacement table and a new light over, lighting is important on the pool table, and a rack for the pool cues and the balls. And they've got a little league that meets every week and plays. And he's taught them some of the players who are brand new or don't know how to play, and gets to play a little bit.
So one of the other things I'd really like to discuss with our listeners today is that, moving to a community isn't just a big change for our loved ones who are moving, but it's also a big change for their family as well. So how did your family kind of navigate that change? And do you have any advice for our listeners on how to handle that as adult children?
It is a good point because it is an adjustment. Now my parents are only a little over an hour away as opposed to 8 hours. So in the early days, I know that it was, heartwarming and emotional that I could see, my parents in person for their birthdays. And, we would try to get back to Maryland, where they're from, as much as possible, but it was usually larger holidays when their grandchildren, when they were younger, were on school breaks and such. Now we can, if there's time in our day or evening or weekend, and when they were driving fine, invite them to family dinners at our home, invite them to my brother's house for holidays, for Christmas, and then we can go and see them when it works in our schedule. So that's a positive. I don't think that's, there's no real advice to navigating that part. I think sometimes it could be tricky as an adult child who's not used to having their parents so close, balancing your own life and work schedule and responsibilities, children, what have you, with, oh gosh, my parents are here and they're inviting me to this event that maybe SMC is allowing residents' families to go to. And of course you want to go and you're close enough that you can, but you have to balance that, with your own life that, no, Mom, I'm not going to be there every single day. Yeah. But we see each other significantly more, like both my brother and my families and our children see their grandparents, our parents, more than we did when they were in Maryland. So the only other advice I think is that you can advocate while they're there as well. If when they move in, your loved ones can have contact information to who to call if you're worried or if you haven't heard from your parent. If you're not super close to visit them and check on them, you can reach out. I don't think we've ever needed to do that, but we know there's that sense of
security.
Exactly. Thank you. And reassurance that we know how to reach out and contact. We know how to stop by and visit. So I would encourage if adult children are leery about that, to advocate for your parent and encourage them to advocate, right? Yes. You don't want them calling you and having you do everything. Yeah. Yes, so exactly. It's an easy adjustment.
So just as we kind of wrap up today, are there any other parts of your parents' story and their journey that you'd like to share with our listeners, or just any other advice you have for adult children or their parents as they kind of search for senior living communities?
I like the idea of thinking of your questions in advance, because when you're there touring a facility and deciding, it's easy to get swept up in, what you're seeing, what the person is sharing. Certainly when your parents ask a question, it might prompt something, but have an idea in your mind of already, maybe have that written down so you don't forget, because I think that really was helpful. And then secondly, think long term, because my parents, and talk with your parents in advance. What do you want out of this? Is skilled nursing or memory care super important to you? Is independent living super important to you? For some people, it isn't. They're fine going right into this assisted living apartments, that kind of thing. My parents, that was a primary criteria for them, that the community they were in had the full continuum of living, full continuum of care. It was important to them to have that independence, like I said in the beginning, in the garage and making their own meals. But then if they need to move to assisted living, or even skilled nursing or memory care type places, and they need to move again for that more intensive care, they're right there. They're already on the same campus. And so just thinking about that, if that's important to you or not, depending on your parents' needs, that was important to my parents. And that is another huge source of comfort. If they have any kind of issue, they can go into the rehab center temporarily and still maintain their independent living while they're recovering from, say, a surgery or a fall or illness. It's all on the same campus. So I would encourage people to think long-term.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's such a huge benefit because, let's say something happens in the community you move to only offers independent living. Well, then you have to start the search for another community with higher care levels. So I do think that's a very important thing to look at when searching for a community. And I also kind of love your advice of make your list of questions ahead of time and so that you're prepared when you go in. I think, the information dump happens when you tour a community and it can be overwhelming. And if you have that list going in ahead of time and you've identified what's important to you, just really focusing on those things, making sure you ask those questions. I think all of that's just extremely great advice for our listeners. So thank you.
You're welcome. One other thing about that is, as the adult child, knowing what your parent wants to ask, either in advance or let's say after the first time you interview, because then the next time you're somewhere or that first time, you might prompt them. So that definitely happened. I knew my dad had certain concerns, but let's say we're listening and mom's asking questions and I say, hey, Dad, what didn't you want to know about parking? And so as the adult child, you can be that sort of facilitator to advocate even in those questions of, this is a concern for your parent, and you can either ask for them or prompt them to ask. Yeah.
No, and I think that's great. And I think that's why it's so important to sit down and have some of these conversations with your parents ahead of going with them to do the tours. Because like you said, you can help advocate for them. You can make sure that their questions are getting answered and you're really looking at the things that are most important to them.
Exactly.
Well, Janie, it was such a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you again, because you shared some very helpful information and great tips for, talking with your parents about moving, how to kind of go through this process with them, how to help advocate for them. So just thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
As always, be sure to like and subscribe to Senior Living Today so you never miss a new episode. And we will be back again with a new episode in 2 weeks.